well as on the PW Stamp School of Art and Design leadership team. Miner's artistic and scholarly practice transcends disciplinary boundaries and geopolitical borders. He holds a PhD in art history, Arts of the Americas from the University of New Mexico. His transdisciplinary training provides the academic foundation for his diverse contributions to the Stamp School of Art and Design. Before joining the University of Michigan, Miner spent 16 years at Michigan State University, MSU, where he served as a professor and later the dean in the Residential College of the Arts and Humanities. At MSU, Miner was also director of American Indian and Indigenous Studies for 7 years. As an artist, Miner has hung more than 24 solo exhibitions and participated in more than 115 group exhibitions. He has created graphics for numerous community organizations, social justice campaigns, and environmental organizations. He is also a founding member of Justseeds, a decentralized artist cooperative of over 40 artists committed to social, environmental, and political engagement. A frequent writer, Miner's book, Creating Aztlán, Chicano Art, Indigenous Sovereignty, and Lowriding Across Turtle Island was published by the University of Arizona Press. In addition, his bibliography includes writings published through Duke University Press, Yale University Press, Oxford University Press, University of Toronto Press, Third Text Publications, Routledge, Palgrave, Macmillan, and many more. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dylan A.T. Miner.
Thank you, April, and thanks all of you for hanging out for the day and listening to so many amazing speakers before me. I'd like to start by thanking April and the Aztlán Research Center, CSU Pueblo, and for, more importantly, for all the workers that make this happen and make all things happen. Just, those who are organized and have collective bargaining units, and those who do not. Just to give a moment to thank all those who make things like this happen and make the world happen. I'd also like to reiterate, as April shared this morning and Ramona before me, that we're in the traditional territory of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute. And this area is also near the Navajo, Hopi, Comanche, and Pueblo peoples, as well as more recently Chicano lands. And I acknowledge traditional raza governance through Aseki and other land and water-based systems. This afternoon, we'll be lowriding through and across Aztlán, the way that we can name the traditional Chicano territory. We'll go from Aztlán, south to Tenochtitlan, and north to Anishinaabe, the traditional homelands of the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, where I was born, raised, and currently live. From my perspective, as an artist and scholar, lowriding, a contemporary yet indigenous practice, serves as the ideal metaphor to understand our relationship to place, especially in locations like Pueblo in southern Colorado. Over the next 40 minutes or so, I will share a bit about me. I will discuss connections that I see between the U.S.-Mexico borderlands and what I have called La Otra Frontera, the U.S.-Canada border. I'll read some brief excerpts from my book, Creating Aztlán, discuss a bit of my own art in relation to lowriding, and some historic examples of Chicanx or Chicane or Chicano, art that connect back to Aztlán and indigenous relations to land and water. And this is all with the guise of looking towards the future. So as our previous speaker, Ramona, asked us to do, it's always important to kind of situate ourselves. So I am a citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario. You'll see up here the word half-breed is utilized. It's a racist pejorative seen in the historic record, but refers to mixed ancestry peoples that emerged in and around the fur trade areas of the Great Lakes and west into other parts of Canada, similar to the word you probably are more familiar with in Spanish, mestizo. The Métis Nation of Ontario in 2017 kind of was recognized by the province of Ontario and then signed two subsequent self-government agreements with Canada in 2019 and 2023. This is an image of my paternal ancestors in our family octopus bag. Some of the beadwork patterns are usually familial, and so these beadwork patterns are ones that remain within my family. As Ramon also said, it's important to kind of situate kind of all sides of your family ancestry. And my mother's side are Scandinavian folks who ended up in Minnesota, and of course we know that Minnesota was in the 1860s the site of the largest mass execution in this country. And of course, although they arrived after this, much of that, the peopling of much of Western North America is put in place by policies such as that, such as the Dakota 38. Also, oops, we living? Okay, I'm just tricking you here. No? Oh, okay, it's there, it's there. No, it's fine. Is that it? Okay, I won't touch it, I swear, I won't touch it. No? Is that it? Okay. So also kind of sharing, kind of images and thinking about my own children and my suegros or my in-laws. So it was nice to hear Tony speak this morning and talk a little bit about Teatro Campesino and their connections to, say, Teatro Mascarones. My children were raised in the danza tradition in Albuquerque, part of Kapuli Chalchihuitzilin. Of course, their Chalchihuitzilin comes out of Guerreros de Chico Mostoc, one of the Movimiento Kapulis. We, at one point, many years ago, decades ago, went to Universidad Naubat, which was run by Mario from Teatro Mascarones. So just thinking about these relations, I think much of, the connections that we learn in things like this are the connections and the relations we have. And as you'll see with my scholarly and artistic work, much of it is about looking at some of the shared histories we see here in these U.S.-Mexico borderlands. I know we're far from that border, but in that territory that was ceded in 1848, and some similar ones that we see in other parts of North America. Just to situate the place I'm coming from the state of Michigan, which you can see here, which had a number of treaties signed between 1807 and 1842. 1842 is an interesting year, and I'll show some work of art in a second. Kind of in the Desert Art Lab talk this morning, there were some images shown of cyanotypes, but the development of the process of the cyanotype happens in 1842, 6 years before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but 1842 is the last year of that land cession in the state that I live. So it's always important to think about and think through the technologies we're engaging with are always connected to these other things happening coterminously or at the same time. So this is the other borderland, the U.S.-Canada borderland here. And I like to show this image. That border is solidified following the War of 1812 and 1827 with the Treaty of Ghent. I like to show this image here on the right. This is just a Google Earth image, but you can see the way here at the Lake Huron and Lake Superior watershed in that borderland area. South, of course, is northern Michigan. The north side is Ontario in Canada. But you see this kind of jump around that happens on Drummond Island. And I always say that was because there were a number of Métis people who fought against the Americans there. And so when the border was put in place, you actually see this. And that includes many members from what is now the Georgian Bay Métis community who, following the implementation of that border, migrated from there across Lake Huron to a different location. And so these impacts, these very real impacts of the implementation of nation state and the borders of nation states are real, both in the north and in the south. We also saw this or a similar map earlier today. This is the 1847 Disternal map. John Disternal was a New York-based cartographer, map maker, and distributor of materials. This is the map that was attached to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And of course, we know that the map was inaccurate, which leads to many complications there. But I bring this up also to make additional connections, because Disternal makes this map in 1847. In the 1860s, he's also making these publications which are discussing communities to create, basically, to allow people to settle into newly allowable areas. And I share this little excerpt from a text from 1868, where he's describing the community in Ontario where my dad's ancestors come from. And you can see here, he talks about it as, here you may see the Indian, the half-breed, the voyageur, and the Europeans. But these connections, the individual making the map connected to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, is also engaged in some of the documentation which enables settling of lands further north from here. So it's a continental process. Those cyanotypes, 1842, that time, thinking about ways that that land and those technologies are connected. Map making is important, and this is part of the setting up, and then I will kind of transition more into thinking and talking about Aztlán. But if we drill down into the map, this is another Google Earth image here, although I've added the red to the left. But this is where my father's family kind of had a territory near the fur trade post called Miners Rapids. But just kind of just south to there, you can see is a place called Poacher's Point. And this artwork here in the bottom right, and if you look closely, you can see is actually an arrest record from poaching, a documented arrest record for my ancestor poaching a deer in the early 1900s. And so it's interesting to think about the way that here, this location, where they were living in a traditional way, was seen by the state as poaching. So what I did as an artist actually was I took this documentation and then screen printed them in animal blood. And so that document in the right there is actually printed in animal blood, which fades over time. So thinking about bringing our own familial histories, our own stories into the making of artwork to engage with some of the larger conversations around healing that we're having today, I think are important ones. But I think by and large I'm here to think through and talk through lowriding. And as I've written, the process of lowriding engages traditional migration patterns. It employs late capitalist machinery. There we go. Is that better? Yeah. All right. So as I've written about, the process of lowriding engages traditional migration patterns. It employs late capitalist machinery, the automobile, to traverse colonized landscapes. While our ancestors moved slowly from place to place, establishing deep roots along the way, contemporaneity and coloniality, just fancy ways to say kind of the contemporary and the histories of colonialism, presuppose that we must hurriedly rush from place to place. In many ways, we could call that capitalism, right? We have to, time is money. Inversely, instead of hastening from one place to another, lowriding as an indigenous ontology, that is an indigenous way of being, actively engages the process of slow movement. Through this intentional slowness, lowriding seamlessly repositions us between various temporalities, that is time periods, moving among multiple spaces and in and out of disparate social structures. Lowriding lowriding becomes a methodology and a framework that we can use to investigate Aztlán and also think through and about Chicano art, as well as migrations across Turtle Island or the Americas. To be clear in my talk today and in the book, I do not write specifically about lowrider culture, but rather use lowriding as a theory and as a way of thinking through the world to help us understand Chicano art from a land-based perspective. As such, I wrote Chicano Art, Creating Aztlán, the book from which I pull some of my thoughts, at least this afternoon, as an attempt to freely and intentionally migrate across multiple temporalities, engaging pre-colonial indigeneities alongside colonial, modern, and contemporary Chicano responses to colonization. Although the book is historical in orientation, my research disavows colonial notions of linear temporality and instead engages Chicano art from a perspective that is diachronic, that is across multiple time periods. So one of the things that I like to think through is that, time is not linear, time is not static, and we can actually pull from different moments in time that we're always doing in ways that help us imagine new futures. We don't only have to be locked in this moment in time. We don't only have to look back at short periods of time, but the ancient, the ancestral is just as important to us as different temporalities or time beings. As both an artist and intellectual, much of my writing employs creative approaches to structure, allowing connections to be made across time and space. Like Anishinaabe writer Jim Northrup said, I rely on the oral tradition to tell my story, so I move from one topic to another. And I've often said when I get up here, I hope people can understand, because I think in constellatory ways. I'm thinking about different stars in the sky pulling from different things, and sometimes they might make sense as I'm pulling from different or locating different stars. And if you know the various stars I'm pointing at, you can see the connections, you can make the constellations. But if you don't have all of those histories, all of that knowledge yet, it might feel a little difficult. But over time, as you start to see and understand the different stars, you too can start to see some of these emerging and new constellations, which in some ways is a way of imagining and thinking through new worlds, but new worlds that are guided to us by old knowledge. Okay, so in my book, Creating Aztlán, I was telling somebody I own one copy, so I couldn't even bring it because I don't have one. But you can probably go to CSU Pueblo's library and download a PDF in full for free. So as a way to save you all money, if you're interested, go to the library. I support libraries. Download that as a PDF. You don't have to pay money to a university press, although support university presses. But yes. I trace multiple strains of Aztlán, the legendary homeland of the Mexica, in hopes of maintaining the global anti-colonial trajectory of the late 1960s. By understanding the nuances of Aztlán, we can develop a deeper and ongoing awareness of the Chicano movement by looking at the artistic and cultural utilization of Aztlán as a utopian and revolutionary gesture toward indigenous sovereignty. My investigation simultaneously culminates and commences in March of '69, when, as many of you are probably familiar, folks from across Turtle Island gathered in Denver to discuss the social, political, and economic demands facing their respective communities. This meeting, known as the Chicano Youth Liberation Conference, created an anti-colonial and indigenous framework for the Chicano movement. It was at this gathering that young Chicanos, Chicanas, Chicanes established a plan of action that synthesized local experiences by collectively striving for national self-determination. And in my own work, and I think this movement was informed by the writings of folks like Frantz Fanon, the Afro-Caribbean writer who said something to the effect of, colonization didn't dream of destroying one culture after another, therefore the reply of the colonized must be continental in scope. And that is some of the reason you get the kind of Pan-Americas, some of those struggles kind of coming together to resist collectively. The authors of the Plan Espiritual de Aztlán, or rather the author, we know it's Alurista, but kind of published an anonymously. The main edict to emerge from the conference focused on the class-based oppression of Chicanos, but positioned their analysis and demands by applying indigenous and Mesoamerican tropes within a contemporary North American context. Although poet Alorista is generally acknowledged as the draftsperson, the plan was issued anonymously. In this document, Aztlán, the mythical place of origin of the Mexica, became the metaphor used to refer to the collective and autonomous sovereignty of Chicanos. So I ask a question, and one that I think we might all ask is, why did Chicanos in this period of time desire to construct their late capitalist identities by converging on an imagery and mythology of pre-contact, yet not pre-colonial, indigenous history? And so commencing from this question, I believe that Aztlán performs a liberatory function for artists and activists while positing additional, interrelated, although not entirely coterminous, arguments with Aztlán at the core. For the most part, the book Creating Aztlán is a history of Chicano art and visual culture that narrates radical Chicano politics, intellectual histories of Aztlán, and utopian indigenous thought. It declares Chicano sovereignty throughout. By addressing activism, and we've heard calls to not necessarily use the term activism today, but which I support, but I address activism and cultural practice. I attend to the multivalent role that Aztlán plays within Chicano communities, and the various ways that artists have articulated the idea within their own visual art. Moreover, investigating how and why artists and activists invoked this concept allows us to continuously implement the idea as a metaphor for both liberation and for sovereignty. Following the work, in my kind of own thinking, I follow the work of Chicano Native feminists. I present a critique of what some have called a false binary, or some have called a binary, between Chicano nationalism and Chicano feminism. One that is based, in my perspective, is based in indigenous feminisms and queer epistemologies, that is, ways of thinking, as a way to reframe Aztlán and Chicano sovereignty. And in my own work, I pay a lot of attention to those cultural practices that happen sometimes outside of the US Southwest. And I look a lot at Chicano practices in Michigan, in Illinois, and I'll show some work in a bit here by two Mexicanos, and one individual from Illinois. Throughout my research and understanding of contemporary politics, I infer that by building a space for themselves within the binary structure of US racial politics, Chicanos have always destabilized Indian identity, that's in air quotes, Indian identity, but do so as an indigenous people. In this way, Chicano nationalists asserted their national indigenous identities through the conglomeration of indigenous and mestizo narratives. Accordingly, in the Plan Espiritual de Aztlán, which hopefully you've all read, has everyone read the plan? Yeah, you can all recite the preamble, I hope. With our heart in our hands and our hands in the soil, we declare the independence of our mestizo nation. We are a bronze people with a bronze culture. Before the world, before all of North America, before all of our brothers in the bronze continent, we are a nation. We are a union of free pueblos. We are Aztlán. So that's the language that's in the preamble. However, as others have written, and I discuss this more in-depthly in my book, within a short period of time, Alorista actually found some of the faults within the preamble, and revised it as a revised poem in his book, Nation Child Pluma Roja. And he moved away from the initial male-centeredness of that, so moves into the idea of brothers and sisters, and I would imagine, and hopefully that would be even move into kind of non-binary spaces in this moment in time. And he also kind of reframes the word bronze, changes it from a bronze people with a bronze culture to a red people with a red culture. So we see actually this shift happening intellectually and artistically and poetically between the preamble being issued following the Chicano Youth Liberation Conference and the 1969 publishing of Nation Child Pluma Roja. Okay, so project called Native Kids Ride Bikes. And it's an ongoing collaboration, you having workshops with urban Chicano and Native youth to build lowrider bicycles, often with elders and communities members there. Just to think about what are those relationships, to think about the connections between brown communities, to think about the connections between youth and elders, oftentimes bringing in language speakers. The first series of them bikes was a series of 7 that was built in Lansing and Detroit, 2 places in Michigan. And then these were a series of 4 of the bikes that were built in Vancouver. And in many ways, they're simultaneously art objects and interesting lowrider bicycles. And for me, right, I understand. I'm from Michigan, the home of the auto culture, and I understand some of the complications of fossil fuel consuming automobiles. And so for that reason, I've always been drawn more to the bicycle as a human-powered way of slowly moving through. And I'll read some kind of metaphors about the need to, some of the kind of metaphorical, beautiful things about a bicycle versus a car. This is one of the workshops to build bikes at Fort Lewis College, and just to cover faces of people who, were in workshops might not consent to showing their face in all spaces. And these were a series that were built in Santa Fe as a collaboration with the Santa Fe Art Institute and MOCNA, the Museum of Contemporary Native Art, based on the 3 sisters, and then that front bike there is Popeye. That's a bike about Popeye. And the second bike is the Popeye one. The one in the front is Beans, but they all have like seed savers on the back. And I love that we kind of artists in this community have taken that Mexican work trike and made things out of it. This is a similar one that I did in Detroit, taking that work trike, gifted it to community organizations so they could screen print at community events. And I'll go a little bit more into Aztlán in a second here. This is a more recent work that I have in Omaha right now, where there are these 7 basically the car club signs in the back there, but each of them are different sites along the migration, the fur trade, the riverways from kind of the eastern Great Lakes into the plains, and each of them connect their different places along that migration trail. So thinking about the way that we migrate between spaces is crucial. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about theorizing lowriding. If you believe Western science, the ancestors slowly migrated to Turtle Island, the Americas, 10,000 years ago, slowly dispersing across the continent. Indigenous communities have their own stories of how they got to be in the place they currently live, but Western science often tells a different one. Indigenous stories, however, are generally more intriguing and include community knowledge embedded within larger life lessons that need to be practiced. Either way, both stories, Western and Indigenous, are about intimately knowing the land where one lives and moving slowly into that place. To lowride across time and space, we begin to pay attention to the environment around us. If Desert Art Lab is about being attentive to one's foodways and about the place, I'd say lowriding is similarly about moving slowly through space and knowing where you're at. Lowriding as an indigenous way of moving through the world contrasts with the speed needed to succeed in a contemporary capitalist world. It is fundamentally anti-capitalist. As we all know, the birthplace of the lowrider is either East LA.
You pick a fight.
and Chimayo, northern New Mexico. Okay, all right. This is, we know that the origins of lowriding are in northern New Mexico. And not contentious. Not contentious. The stories of how Chicanos emerged in Española, Chimayo, northern New Mexico, East Los Angeles. And here I'm thinking about indigenous emergence and migration stories, this is part of it, is based on whom you speak with. Whatever story you hear, however, it certainly includes the process of at least some slow migration into that territory. This migration, lowriding, predates the existence of the automobile. Although created sometime in the late 20th century, decades after lowrider cars, lowrider bicycles are the epitome of contemporary indigenous movement. And I kind of came of age in the 90s. I think that was the heyday of lowrider bikes. They are simple machines with two wheels. The wheels must be kept moving if the bike is to remain upright. Constant rotations of the wheels keep the rider in a stable and mobile position. When the wheels stop rotating, the bike becomes static and the rider will eventually fall to the ground. This could be read as an indigenous story about the need to maintain equilibrium in the world. Unlike the desire of a traditional cyclist whose hope it is to move as quickly as possible, the lowrider's goal is to move as slowly and as intentionally as viable. Lowriding is about moving through space while being cognizant of the journey and the migration itself. To make sense of all of this, we must traverse great expanses of time and space, beginning in Aztlán and moving slowly southward towards Tenochtitlan. Traveling southward for more than 2 centuries, we eventually return north in search of Aztlán, or some might say El Dorado or Cibola. Throughout this migration or slow riding story, both southward and northward, relationship to place must always be acknowledged. Nearly a millennium prior to its evocation in the plan espiritual, Aztlán served as foundation of Mexica or Aztec political ideology. By tracing the genealogy of this place, we lay the foundation for seeing Aztlán as the emergence place, a common ontological origin of indigenous societies. So Aztlán as the place where Chicanos emerged. Although structurally distinct from its Chicano articulation, so I actually think that the Mexica Aztlán is not the same as the Chicano Aztlán. Okay. So I'm going to show some codices. The story goes like this, and this is the Codex Botarini, and we can see here, the story goes something like this. In the 12th century, the Mexica were directed by their divine theot, or deity, Huitzilopochtli. We heard Huitzilopochtli earlier today, about a mural in Denver. Some translate his name as left-handed hummingbird to lead their utopian paradise, or so it is frequently presented, and migrate south. Although history usually remembers them simply as the Aztecs, the Mexica were one of 7 tribal groups dwelling in Aztlán, an island riddled with caves. As one of 7 tribes, the Mexica were the only society to follow the advice of Huitzilopochtli and leave Aztlán at that time. The other clans subsequently migrated to found different city-states in Mesoamerica, not Tenochtitlan. According to the codices, Huitzilopochtli, the spiritual energy of the sun and war, advised the Mexica to leave and head south in search of a new home. And so for around 250 years, the Mexica traversed, or we could say low-rided, across the continent, searching for a site to permanently settle. To find their location, Huitzilopochtli prophesied that they would encounter divine apparition. You all know this apparition. Eventually, in around 1325 Common Era, in what is now Mexico City, Mexica elders encountered what they were searching for: an eagle perched at a nopal, feasting on the body of a serpent. Viewing this miraculous sight, elders noted that Huitzilopochtli's prophecy had come true. Following the advice of their divine theot, the Mexica founded a successful, albeit hierarchical, and imperial society at this location, among other Nahuatl-speaking cultures. Tenochtitlan, as the city was known, quickly became the largest urban environment in the Western Hemisphere. In many regards, Tenochtitlan served as a mirror to their site of origin, Aztlán. You can look in the records, and there are kind of documentation that Aztlán and Tenochtitlan visually are mirrors of one another. But Tenochtitlan, as we know, would not rule, their political power would not rule eternally, as the Spanish, who came in the names of the great spirits, both King and Christ, would colonize and subjugate Anahuac. So, through the process of warfare and the demolition of libraries, the irreplaceable narratives of the Aztlán migration story, what's encoded in the codices and brought to life through performance. So this was often performed by kind of spiritual leaders, so the knowledge around the codices and around the Aztlán story were performed. Those performances over time end. And what we see then, this is, I should have showed this slide earlier, this is the migration part of that. We can see this figure in the middle. That bundle on their back is Huitzilopochtli being kind of carried in a bundle in a sacred way as the migration happens south, goes southward. This is another toponym, what you call those kind of structures there for Aztlán in the book form Codex Aubin, dated at 1576. But I really think for our conversation, some of this more contemporary, and I'll say contemporary begins in 1969. As we look across time and space, we can see Aztlán having a number of functions. It's a migration narrative, it's a place of emergence, it's what some indigenous literary scholars would call a triballography, that is stories that build a nation. It's the center of the world, it's a utopia, and utopias by definition can and will never be. It's a redefinition of space, it's the Chicano nation, and it's so many other things. Across all of these, Aztlán enables an upended interpretation of what a shared future might look like. Read briefly, and then I will kind of walk through some artworks. Alorista, the poet who drafted El Plan Espiritual, writes in the history of Aztlán that Aztlán, Aztlán, a call for justice. Aztlán, Aztlán, a call for freedom. Aztlán, Aztlán, a call for nationhood. Dedicated for the humanization of man and woman. Dedicated to the preservation of earth and sun. Rooted in brotherhood and sisterhood. Rooted in collective labor and self-sacrifice. Or queer Chicana poet Cherie Moraga does not turn away from nationalism, the nationalism that Alorista calls to, when she affirms that the nationalism I seek is one that decolonizes the brown and female earth. It is a new nationalism in which La Chicana Indígena stands at the center, and heterosexism and homophobia are no longer the cultural order of the day. I cling to the word nation because without the specific naming of the nation, for her it's Aztlán, the nation will be lost. Let us retain a radical naming, but expand it to meet a broader and wiser revolution. So we start to see Aztlán within art around the late 1960s. These are important works here. Of course, the one on the left is by Denver's Manuel Martinez, the 1969 serigraph called Mestizo Banner, and the one on the right by the Texas-born, New Mexico-based Amado Peña. Also a serigraph. Serigraph is just a fancy way to say screen print. These are screen prints from the late 60s and 70s, framing Mexican Americans as Chicanos, as mestizos. And it's important because there's been, at least in many of the intellectual worlds I exist in, a criticism of the Chicano movement for utilizing the kind of, or reclaiming the idea of mestizaje, one that Matt earlier today turned to Guillermo Bonfield, a Mexican anthropologist, to go away from. But one of the things that I think is important is that if in Mexico, kind of in the nationalist era, Jose Vasconcelos' Raza Cosmica was written as a way to de-indigenize and bring people into the nation state. I think what you see here in the territories appropriated in the 1848 treaty is this idea of mestizaje is actually a reaffirmation of indigeneity. It's It's a turning away from the whiteness of certain histories. And so they're competing, and sometimes they get talked about as the same, but I actually think they function politically very different and within the boundaries of the Mexican nation state and within the boundaries of the racial politics of the United States. Some other artworks that we see around this time, it's good that Tony mentioned Dani Valdez, of course. This is the UFW, or rather the Teatro Campesino Community Cultural Center in Del Rey, California. This is one of the early important murals. On the one side, on the left of the entrance, we can see danzantes kind of engaged in ceremony. We can see the copal, the saumador on the right, and on the left, and then on the kind of to the right of that, on the other side, is this beautiful mural by Antonio Bernal of various revolutionaries, beginning with the unnamed Adelita on the right, all the way to Martin Luther King, just kind of going through figures. You've got Pancho Villa, Zapata, Murrieta, Chavez, Reyes Lopez Tijerina, Malcolm X with the Black Panther shirt on, and then Martin Luther King. Of course, they are predominantly male figures, and we must recognize that and name that. But we certainly start to see in the work and building off, I think, the narrative shared this morning about Su Teatro, we start to see kind of the retelling, the remaking of these stories. But they're not just happening kind of in what we would call the U.S. Southwest. They're happening kind of in other places where Chicanos migrated for a long time. This is an artwork by George Vargas and Martin Moreno. Moreno went to Arizona. Vargas taught for a long time at Texas A&M Kingsville, where Santa Barraza and others were. This is called City Spirit. It's in the southwest Detroit, what's called Mexican Town. And the interesting thing about the Barrio Mexicano in Detroit is it's actually, right, Canada's north of the United States, but like in that little space, because of the river, Canada is south. So here, right here, the Mexican neighborhood is literally on the Canada border. The bridge to Canada comes from this neighborhood, but it like inverts the north-south of the U.S. and Canada in a similar fashion. So there's some interesting complexities there. Nora Chapa Mendoza, also another Michigan Chicana artist. I like this one on the right. It's a kind of showing some of the, it's based on photographic documentation. Dennis Valdez's work on farm labor and Chicano workers in the north is an important one to look at for that. But you can see here, if you look at, they need petebeleros, they need sugar beet workers in Michigan. And if you look at the cities listed here, Alma, Croswell, Carroll, Lansing, Seedwing, I grew up in Carroll. Each of these communities, rural communities, still have small but vibrant Chicano Mexicano communities that settled out primarily because of the sugar beet work there. And this image on the left is actually becoming, I think, shockingly relevant again right now, because it actually documents, it's called Repatriados. The right and the left are actually in the naming of it. So yeah, I guess from you can't see, there's actually red text up here telling you the name of the artworks, but I think it doesn't show up with the lighting. This work on the left is called Repatriados. And if we remember, in the 1930s, there was an active deportation campaign very similar to the one we're in at this moment. It was called a repatriation campaign. And it was very vibrant in places like Michigan. Diego Rivera, the famous muralist, actually painted one of his best murals of his career in Detroit at that time. It was the location, where Frida had a stillbirth in the city when they were living there in 32, 33. But Rivera, because he supported wanted to support the community, actually used the monies he made from that mural to support more humane transit for Chicano Mexicano people into Mexico, kind of as part of that so-called repatriation campaign. But an image like this, you can see people kind of in that forced southward migration, which, as we see with these very violent attacks going on right now, is even more relevant. I like to bring this one up. This one, if we're talking about Aztlán, we can't talk about radical politics in Aztlán and not think about, for me at least, think about this. If anyone knows the history of Mecha, there was a split that happened in 97. I guess if anyone knows the history of Mecha, you'll know there's lots of splits that happen within Mecha. But anyway, so I think this is a beautiful one because it actually, speaks towards, and this is Tatma Reles is the individual who made this, but kind of tries to frame Aztlán within a certain non-nation state kind of anarchist politic that goes away from something, a different way of thinking. Okay, I'm going to show about 2 or 3 more works and then open it up for dialogue and questions. An artist that I don't think is discussed enough is Carlos Cortez Coyocuicat, a Chicano artist originally from Milwaukee, spent his adult life in Chicago, was heavily involved in the industrial workers of the world. I've written about this elsewhere, but he organized a show in Chicago, an exhibition called Anishinaabe Aztlán. Anishinaabe is the Ojibwe or the Anishinaabe word for kind of their indigenous territories. Generally, I mean, you could just translate it in its most crass sense, Indian land, but it really refers to the upper Great Lakes. And it was an exhibition that toured around Chicago in the late 1970s of Chicano and Native artists. Included an important and interesting organization out of Chicago called the Movimiento Artístico Chicano March, which again, another group, because of I think their location in Chicago, doesn't have enough written about them. But Carlos was really about solidarity and connecting. You can see here, he's referencing, this is a poem, he was also a poet, connecting with this mixed ancestry Native activist who was involved in the industrial workers of the world. And then finally, maybe this will be, I've got lots of other artists and images to show, but just for the sake of time. This one on the right is called Orgullo Ixachilatleca. Ixachilan, of course, just is, in some interpretations from now, it just refers to the Americas. But I think there's something beautiful about the naming of it as Ixachilatleca, going against the boundaries that we established because of nation states. It's really hemispheric. And I think that's one of the things that for me, if it was intended as a liberatory idea to bring people together, Aztlán, I think what we've seen within some potential critiques of it is that it can also separate. And so in this work here, created in 1991 on the eve of the 500th anniversary of the arrival of Christopher Columbus, right? He's already thinking and talking and articulating a hemispheric politics, which I think is something that nearly 35 years later, we can, recall and call up. I'm not going to show these other ones. Should I pull it up? You can see my messy desktop. I was going to show an image. I went to Vienna this summer to go to an archive because they have the oldest kopili, the oldest headdress. The only remaining Aztec Mexica pre-colonial headdress is in Austria. And there's a kind of a recreation of it in Mexico City. But they refused to repatriate it in this complex situation. But a beautiful object. But that same museum also has a very robust collection of beadwork from the Great Lakes. And just thinking about Carlos's work there, where he articulates this hemispheric resisted politics, Orgullo Iztaccilatleca, and then this museum, this anthropology museum in Vienna, Austria, having the oldest kopili or penacho or headdress, is a interesting one that I wanted to kind of sit with. So with that, let me turn it over to all of you. Thank you for kindly listening to me ramble and throw some stars in the sky for you to hopefully make some constellations of. And if not today, maybe in the weeks and years to come, you'll see some of those constellations connect up. So Chimigwech, Marci, thank you.
We'll take a couple questions from the audience.
And while you get that question, I made a bunch of risographs, these two risograph posters here. I made specifically just limited edition for this. You can come grab them. There's 50 of each. They're texts from the Plan Espiritual, and then one of them is photographs from the Movimiento, and then one of them is photographs from recent anti-ice raids. So just thinking about those different moments in time. They're there, as well as some other risographs. There's one of Gloria and Saltua, one of, anyway, they're up here, feel free to take them, they're gifts.
Thank you for your work and your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I loved your comparison to the way you speak and storytell with, constellations. On that, I feel I speak the same, so sometimes I wonder if I am articulating what I'm trying to ask well. So my first question is, you shared with us your ancestry, and I was wondering what led you to the path of learning more about Chicano history and our ancestry? And my second question is, I'm really addicted to TikTok, so I'm always on there. And right now there's a lot of discourse, and it makes me sad to see, but there's a lot of discourse within the Native community, particularly the northern tribes, about Aztlán and how Aztlán could be, or to them is a part of indigenous erasure, which is understandable. And you kind of touched up on a little bit what Aztlán means to you, which isn't really necessarily like a national nation state movement, but more so like a political ideology. And so my question is, let's see if I can articulate it, how would you further maybe explain or engage in conversation with our relatives who feel offended or hurt by Aztlán?
Two good questions. The first one, I guess I in many ways grew up in a Chicano community or in a white community around a lot of Chicano folks, and kind of that's the space I grew up in, and then started seeing and wanted to and saw those connections, those shared connections, and then over the past 35 years of actually engaged in looking at them historically and things like that. So that's the first part. The second one, you're right. I think there's been a lot of critiques from many different sides on the concept of Aztlán, and Aztlán, I think, in this moment in time, from some, is a very contentious concept. I don't see it as such. So, from my perspective, there can be shared territoriality. That oftentimes we enter into whether it's land-based or rights access or a variety of other things from a zero-sum perspective, and I don't buy into that. There's lots of places within this continent and globally where there are competing and conflicting indigenous claims to territory. That's a reality, whether good, bad, or otherwise. So there's that. From my perspective, Aztlán does not override the other indigenous sovereignties that are in those territories. So they can either be mutually constitutive, both being made up, or they can overtop but not overwrite. So I think that, from my perspective, that's one of the ways I answer that. I hear and understand that concern, but I think that doesn't deal with a lot of other issues that are there. So.
Any other questions? Yes.
So 2 or 3 years ago, they had an art exhibit at the Denver Art Museum, the Lowrider, and it was really interesting because one whole section was devoted to Dene or Navajo skateboards, and it never dawned on me, but I guess the skateboards are lowriders in a way. Did anybody see that exhibit in Denver? It was wonderful, but the whole section was devoted.
Was it Apache skates? Was it?
That was Dene.
There was Navajo. Okay.
Yeah, but it was a whole room of, and the designs were indigenous, Navajo indigenous, and it never, not till now, that maybe they're lowriders.
Yeah, I think it's how you frame it, right? That's the work of a curator to potentially put them in relation.
I just wondered if you.
Last minute questions. Dylan will be here after our closing remarks for our reception. So if you have any other questions, would like to speak to him more about any of these topics, you're welcome to talk to him then. I will invite our Dean of the University Library, Rhonda Gonzalez Manzanares, to give our closing remarks. And then after that, please feel free to stay for the reception, pick up a print. There are limited prints, so please ask that everyone just take one so that everyone can leave with one. You're welcome to come and grab one after the closing remarks. And then we will have a cash bar and music, so please stay and mingle.
Thank you.
Hi everyone. Wow. Can you help me thank Dr. Dylan, A.T. Minor, one more time? You know I was going to be giving closing remarks, so throughout the day I tried to take notes and think about, okay, what are the themes? What can I say? And honestly, I just gave up. I don't know what to say. It was amazing. I learned so much, and I feel like, these ideas are just swirling around in my mind. I hope you feel the same way. And I'm not a historian or an artist or a playwright, but I think to me, what I took away from today that I'm gonna think about in my mind is that we all come from this perspective that we can heal ourselves through our creativity. We all have a story to tell, and I was just so struck by the way everyone tapped into their place, their land, their ancestors, their stories, and did something creative with it. And you can do that. You don't have to be a professional artist or singer to do that in your own life. So maybe we can all go home and think about that a little bit. In my closing remarks, I just want to say a little word about today. So I know there have been some names thrown out there. Can you all hear me okay? I just want to thank some people for making today possible. So I'm the Dean of Library Services here at CSU Pueblo, and the Aztlán Research Center is part of the library, but it was the brainchild of a few people. And some of them are in the room. So are Juan and Debbie Espinosa still here? I remember, the day that we were sitting around talking about we need a here on our campus, and that was kind of the seed of creating this Aztlán Research Center. And we're still kind of a baby research center, but we're growing every year. And as mentioned, this is our 5th annual Summer Institute. Every year we take a little bit of a different lens to learn about and celebrate some aspect related to our place and the people that we serve. And I'm happy to announce that we will have a permanent director, which is Dr. Jesus Jaime Diaz, who's coming in a few weeks. So when you come next summer, he'll be here. But I would like to take a moment to thank April Bojorquez, who's been our interim director. Thank you, April. And she'll be around too. We're going to continue to draw on her expertise to help us. Also, I'd like to thank the Chicano Studies program for financial support as well as planning for today's event. And also, John, thank you to the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs for your support for this event. Also, many people on our staff, some of whom are still here, Julie Stevens. Julie, thank you so much. Curry, one of our librarians. Charlene Garcia, who was in our archivist, and then Maria Meyer, who is our archivist at and many other people. So thank you all for your work in putting together, and thank you all for being here. And as April said, we hope you'll all stay, have a drink, listen to the music. The music is being given to us today by Mariachi Diamante from here in Pueblo.